Whether you love him or not, UFC President Dana White is one of the most significant characters in combat sports today, having contributed significantly to the development of the top mixed martial arts organization. However, it would be an understatement to suggest that he has made his fair share of poor decisions after 2 decades in the public eye. Without further ado, let's look at 10 absurd things that Dana White has said, which are listed in no particular sequence. Wanderlei Silva address. Dana White certainly has a fun and likable side to him, but when he wants to, he can also be a bit mean-spirited. And this side to White was on full display when he made some pretty bad comments about Chris Cyborg, comments that were totally out of left field. At this point in time, Cyborg had yet to sign with the UFC, and in Dana's eyes, knocking the Brazilian down a few pegs was the perfect way to cool hype around a fight between her and the UFC's bantamweight queen, Ronda Rousey. When Dana decided to compare Chris Cyborg to Wanderlei Silva in a dress, however, it really wasn't a good look. In a room full of media who understandably left the comment with an awkward silence, Dana went straight for the jugular on the legendary featherweight. In hindsight, this really wasn't a good comment to make, and though the pair would later patch things up briefly, it's fair to say that Dana White and Chris Cyborg never truly got over this. This is not a career. Fighter pay has always been a real point of interest when it comes to the general discussions around the UFC and their practices. And these days, more and more fighters are speaking out against the company, testing the waters of free agency, and even dipping their toe into the boxing ring. So when Dana was asked about the subject of fighter pay during the COVID-19 pandemic, its response left a lot of us quite surprised. Which, when taken literally, really does sound like Dana's own way of distancing himself from being fairer to his fighters. It's a long and complicated conversation to have, but Dana really didn't do himself any favors here. Not a needle mover. It's crazy to think about it now, but for the majority of his time in the UFC, Nate Diaz was mainly seen as Nick Diaz's younger brother. He was a great fighter, of course, but not the massive draw and elite talent that his older brother was. Dana made the mistake of openly criticizing Nate Diaz for not being a needle mover as a pay-per-view draw during a particularly rough period of his career. And sure, at the time it may have made more sense, but when Nate went on to become one of the biggest superstars in the sport, we're guessing even Uncle Dana was left red-faced by his lack of foresight. In many ways, it actually makes Nate Diaz's ascent that much more satisfying. The funky one. Dana and the legendary welterweight Ben Askren have had their fair share of run-ins over the years. Back when Ben was the Bellator champion of the world, Dana was never afraid to call in an incredibly boring competitor who would stand no chance in the UFC. Jump forward to the end of Askren's somewhat unfortunate UFC run, and Dana's opinion on his former foe had softened a little bit. However, what really stood out to us was when White tried to bet $1 million on Askren beating Jake Paul in the boxing ring. Unfortunately, despite his elite wrestling pedigree, Ben Askren was never seen as a man with good striking, and is arguably one of the worst stand-up fighters in MMA history. Of course, Jake Paul would make extremely quick work of the funky one, knocking him stiff in one round. In the end, it makes you wonder if Dana actually did put his money on the table. Dana White and women, look, you can never predict the future, but any sharp promoter should know that closing a door entirely is never the right move. And for Dana White, this was never more true than when he was asked by a TMZ interviewer whether women would ever find a place in the UFC. His response: no chance. And if we skip forward a couple of years to the emergence of Ronda Rousey, this wasn't exactly a great take. Nowadays, the promotion has a total of 4 women's divisions, and prior to Conor McGregor, it was clear that Ronda Rousey was another level of superstar entirely, a real crossover success story for the company. Of course, in such a public role, you're going to make oversights every now and then. But Dana clearly dropped the ball on this one. You have to do the PR. As far as being consistent goes, Dana almost assumes that the general public has the memory of a goldfish. Back in 2016, when Conor McGregor tried to strong-arm the UFC in cutting down his media responsibilities ahead of his rematch with Nate Diaz, which was initially set for UFC 200, the standoff eventually saw Conor pulled from the fight and retire from the sport. Dana White made it clear that it doesn't matter who you are, you have to do the PR. Jump ahead to UFC 207 and the return of Ronda Rousey, and Dana had seemingly forgotten his very public stance on the matter. Rousey was totally absent for the entirety of the media circus surrounding her return, after Dana gave her a very special exemption. It makes you wonder if he did it out of spite for Conor's attack on the company. But either way, it certainly didn't seem to help Rousey on fight night, as Amanda Nunes ran through her to earn a first-round TKO. The 9-11 incident. Although the UFC president has made several controversial statements, this next one was pretty tone-deaf. After the UFC website was hacked back in 2012, Dana White, for reasons that aren't exactly clear, decided to use the USA's response to 9/11 as a reference point for how the UFC would act. In hindsight, it was a very strange comment to make, but the gist of it was that Dana White spoke about the reaction to 9/11, how the public mourned and then rallied to fight back, and that the UFC, like the US government, would strike back, promising that the hackers would get bin Ladened. And yes, these are actual words that came out of Dana White's mouth. Fighter pay in boxing, a recent entry up next, and one that really sums up Dana's approach to combating criticism of fighter pay. This time, instead of being defensive over his own treatment of fighters, he decided to attack boxing, saying that boxers were overpaid and that promoters in the sport have no idea how to run a sustainable business. Now, in fairness to Dana, the real answer is probably somewhere in the middle, and even Eddie Hearn agreed to some extent with what he was saying. But knowing Dana, he was really only doing this to take a shot at those who criticize his business practices, as well as any fighters who might decide to follow Francis Ngannou and Conor McGregor as they look for opportunities outside of the promotion. Cynthia who? Ronda Rousey, Conor McGregor, Cynthia Calvillo? Sure, some of the more committed fans among you will probably be well aware of the UFC flyweight contender Cynthia Calvillo. She's no doubt a talented fighter, but so far she hasn't found the type of form in the UFC that would lead her to a top 5 spot. But when she was originally debuted in the UFC with wins, and was so excited that he said that Cynthia Calvillo had something special, something he had only seen from Ronda Rousey and Conor McGregor in the past.
First time I ever met Conor McGregor, I called Lorenzo and I said, man, I don't know if this guy can fight, but if he can even throw a punch, he's going to be a fucking rock star. You know, and I've had Ronda Rousey, I had a 45-minute meeting with her and decided to do women's MMA. And I feel pretty strongly about this one, too.
Unfortunately, though she has been decent during her 6, 4, and 1 run in the UFC, this comment has aged like milk, and there's really no other way to put it. Good for the fighters. And finally, we come to the Reebok deal. If you know anything about the UFC's expansion in recent years, you'll know that their extremely controversial deal with Reebok was met with almost unanimous criticism. Fighters, who are pretty underpaid as it is, usually depend on external sponsors for a large chunk of their income. So when the UFC opted to ban customizable shorts and force their athletes to wear Reebok-branded gear, they were depriving their athletes of the chance to earn extra money by stamping their fight kit with their sponsors. Dana, in response to this, said that the Reebok deal was good for the fighters, jumped forward to the modern day and the move to the Venom deal, and this could not be further from the truth. Whether you're fighting on the prelims or the main event, the money these fighters receive from the kit deals is pretty insulting when compared with what they could have potentially gotten elsewhere. But hey, Dana White has a company to run, and the UFC seems to be rolling in the cash after this deal. As always, if you guys enjoyed the video, please be sure to let me know by leaving a and subscribing to our channel. Apart from that, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.